Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Friday. Wow, what a day. I mean, when the White House released the phone call that has led to these impeachment proceedings against President Trump now, when they released the call of President Trump speaking with the Ukrainian president about how President Trump wanted that foreign government to do investigations for him, wanted to do him a favor and give him something he might be able to use against the Democrats and Joe Biden in 2020. The most amazing thing about the release of that transcript, of course, was just the fact that the White House released that transcript, right? I mean, the whistleblower complaint, which we knew a little bit about at the time, had suggested that the president had done this bombshell thing. He'd actually gone to this foreign government and asked them for help against the Democrats. It was amazing that the White House then, in response to the furor over that reported whistleblower complaint, the White House then released this document, the notes of that call, proving that, in fact, that's exactly what the president had done. The whistleblower was right. So, I mean, that was the most surprising thing about it, that they released it at all. But the most chilling thing about it was what President Trump said on that call about one particular U.S. government employee. While he was speaking with his foreign leader, seeking help on his reelection effort, sort of apropos of nothing, the president brought up a senior State Department official whom he had just fired, whom he had just recalled as ambassador to that foreign country. And according to the White House's own notes from the call, which they released, the president told that foreign leader, without prompting, quote, "The former ambassador from the United States, the woman, was bad news." He then told the Ukrainian president, quote, "Well, she's going to go through some things." That was chilling. In fact, that ambassador, that woman, as the president puts it, Marie Yovanovitch, a 33-year veteran of the U.S. State Department, is now going through some things. We're starting to realize she may have been the wrong person to mess with here, though. At least the way she comported herself in the midst of this impeachment proceeding today is anything to go by. I mean, God forbid, you or I ever find ourselves in this kind of circumstance with this kind of pressure on us, with this kind of incredible power arrayed against us, and with stakes this high, right? But if it happens to any of us, really the most you could hope for from yourself is that you would have the stones and the dignity to be 1/10 as brave and sort of righteous as Marie Yovanovitch was in this circumstance today. Marie Yovanovitch still works for the U.S. State Department, even though they fired her as the ambassador to Ukraine. We learned only today that once again, in the dead of night, the State Department, apparently on orders from the White House, phoned her up in the middle of the night and told her that they wouldn't allow her to testify this morning. She was prohibited from showing up and talking to Congress today. Well, we also learned that in anticipation of that act from the White House and the State Department, the impeachment committees planned ahead. They appeared to have a subpoena for her ready to go. Marie Yovanovitch decided today to obey that subpoena. She showed up on Capitol Hill today. She didn't have some car service with blacked out windows drop her off near one of the back entrances where nobody could see. She got dropped off right in front, walked all the way across the Capitol grounds, unafraid, walked into the impeachment committees and testified for hours. And it was on the basis of her testimony today that you got these headlines across every major news organization in the country today. The Washington Post, ousted Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch tells Congress Trump pressured State Department to remove her. Wall Street Journal, Trump pressed for Ukraine envoy's removal. The New York Times, Trump had Ukraine envoy removed on false claims, she tells House Inquiry. And there were other headlines that emerged over the course of the day while she was testifying. That, for example, despite the State Department under Mike Pompeo putting out this bogus statement that she was leaving her post in Ukraine as planned, not only was her departure not as planned, it was abrupt. She was literally told to get on the next plane, according to her testimony today. She also says the number 2 official at the State Department under Mike Pompeo told her that she was being recalled on orders of the president and also that she had done nothing wrong. You may have also seen headlines from Yovanovitch's testimony today concerning these guys. Yovanovitch testifying apparently in detail today about how the people working in Ukraine to spread false information about her appeared to include these 2 guys who seem to have been carrying out this op along with the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. The reason we have mugshots of these guys is because these, of course, are the same two guys who have just been arrested and are now facing criminal charges in the Southern District of New York for, among other things, an alleged scheme to illegally funnel large Russian donations to various Republican campaigns. But the other truly, I don't really know the word, baller? The other baller thing Marie Yovanovitch did today was that although her testimony was behind closed doors at the request of the impeachment committees, she decided to release her opening statement publicly. And I don't know if she will ever testify in public. I don't know if this is the only way we will ever hear from her as the American public. But if this statement that we got to see from her is her legacy in this impeachment inquiry, it would be hard to imagine a more sort of stirring and cogent statement about the way government is supposed to work. On a nonpartisan basis, just the way good government works and the way American values are supposed to be conveyed overseas by our foreign service officers. This was her talking about government as it is supposed to be, as opposed to what has just happened under this administration, which has led to the president now being impeached. Let me just read a little bit from her statement today. Marie Yovanovitch. For the last 33 years, it has been my great honor to serve the American people as a foreign service officer over 6 administrations, 4 Republican and 2 Democratic. I've served in 7 different countries, 5 of them hardship posts, and was appointed to serve as an ambassador 3 times, twice by a Republican president and once by a Democrat. Throughout my career, I have stayed true to the oath that foreign service officers take and observe every day, that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Like all foreign service officers with whom I have been privileged to serve, I have understood that oath as a commitment to serve on a strictly nonpartisan basis, to advance the foreign policy determined by the incumbent president, and to work at all times to strengthen our national security and promote our national interests. Ukraine is a sovereign country whose borders are inviolate and whose people have the right to determine their own destiny. These are the bedrock principles of our policy. Because of Ukraine's geostrategic position bordering Russia on the east, it's the warm waters of the oil-rich Black Sea to its south, and 4 NATO allies to its west, it is critical to the security of the United States that Ukraine remain free and democratic, and that it continue to resist Russian expansionism. Russia's purported annexation of Crimea, its invasion of eastern Ukraine, and its de facto control over the Sea of Azov make clear Russia's malign intentions toward Ukraine. If we allow Russia's actions to stand, we will set a precedent that the United States will regret for decades to come. She then talks a little bit in her testimony about the threat of corruption and why corruption is bad, the kind of damage it does, why we should all fight against it, why it's in our nation's interest that we fight against it. And I know that in this statement she is talking about Ukraine, but it is hard not to hear America in the background, given what we are going through right now and given the revelations surrounding this impeachment and this administration. She says, quote, "The revolution of dignity and the Ukrainian people's demand to end corruption forced the new Ukrainian government to take measures to fight the rampant corruption that has long permeated that country's political and economic systems." Why is this important? Put simply, anti-corruption efforts serve Ukraine's interests. They serve ours as well. Corrupt leaders are inherently less trustworthy, while an honest and accountable Ukrainian leadership makes a U.S.-Ukraine partnership more reliable and more valuable to the United States. A level playing field in this strategically located country, one with a European landmass exceeded only by Russia and one of the largest populations in Europe, creates an environment in which U.S. business can more easily trade, invest, and profit. Corruption is a security issue as well, because corrupt officials are vulnerable to Moscow. In short, it's in our national security interest to help Ukraine transform into a country where the rule of law governs and corruption is held in check. To be clear, she says, Ukraine is filled with many citizens and officials who want the very things we've always said we want for our own country. A government that acts in the interests of its people, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. She then goes on to describe the circumstances under which she was ousted and the campaign that was run against her by the conservative media, frankly, and by Rudy Giuliani, and apparently by these two guys who have now just been arrested. She says, quote, "I want to categorically state that I have never, myself or through others, directly or indirectly, ever directed, suggested, or in any other way asked for any government or government official in Ukraine or elsewhere to refrain from investigating or prosecuting actual corruption. Equally fictitious is the notion that I am disloyal to President Trump. I've heard the allegation in the media that I supposedly told the embassy team to ignore President Trump's orders, quote, since he was going to be impeached. That allegation is false. I've never said such a thing to my embassy colleagues or to anyone else." Contrary to other similar reports, she says, quote, "The Obama administration did not ask me to help the Clinton campaign or harm the Trump campaign, nor would I have taken any such steps if they had." And then she talks about her firing. "After being asked by the department in early March to extend my tour until 2020, I was then abruptly told the following month, in late April, to come back to Washington from Ukraine, quote, on the next plane. You will understandably want to ask why my posting ended so suddenly. I wanted to learn that too, and I tried to find out. I met with the Deputy Secretary of State, John Sullivan, who informed me of the curtailment of my term. He said that the president had lost confidence in me and no longer wished me to serve as his ambassador. He added that there had been a concerted campaign against me and that the department had been under pressure from the president to remove me since the summer of 2018. He also said that I had done nothing wrong, and this was not like other situations where he had recalled ambassadors for cause. She says, I departed Ukraine for good this past May. And then this is the part that somebody somewhere is going to get tattooed on them. Although I understand that I served at the pleasure of the president, I was nevertheless incredulous that the U.S. government chose to remove an ambassador based, as best as I can tell, on unfounded and false claims by people with clearly questionable motives. I have served this nation honorably for more than 30 years. I have proudly promoted and served American interests as the representative of the American people and 6 different presidents over the last 3 decades. Throughout that time, I, like my colleagues at the State Department, have always believed that we enjoyed a sacred trust with our government. We make a difference every day on issues that matter to the American people, whether it's war and peace, trade and investment, or simply helping with a lost passport. We repeatedly uproot our lives, and we frequently put ourselves in harm's way to serve this nation. And we do that willingly because we believe in America and its special role in the world. We also believe that in return, our government will have our backs and protect us if we come under attack from foreign interests. That basic understanding no longer holds true. Today, we see the State Department attacked and hollowed out from within. State Department leadership with Congress needs to take action now to defend this great institution and its thousands of loyal and effective employees. I fear that not doing so will harm our nation's interest, perhaps irreparably. That harm will come not just through the inevitable and continuing resignation and loss of many of this nation's most loyal and talented public servants. The harm will come when private interests circumvent professional diplomats for their own gain, not the public good. The harm will come when bad actors in countries beyond Ukraine see how easy it is to use fiction and innuendo to manipulate our system. In such circumstances, the only interests that will be served are those of our strategic adversaries, like Russia, that spread chaos and attack the institutions and norms that the U.S. helped create and which we have benefited from for the last 75 years. I am proud of my work in Ukraine. The U.S. Embassy, under my leadership, represented and advanced the policies of the United States government. Our efforts were intended and evidently succeeded in thwarting corrupt interests in Ukraine, who fought back by selling baseless conspiracy theories to anyone who would listen. Sadly, someone was listening, and our nation is the worse off for that. Marie Yovanovitch today, defying the White House and the State Department to give that testimony to the impeachment committees in the House after they subpoenaed her for that testimony. I mean, if there's still going to be a State Department in this country, doesn't that make you want to be a Foreign Service officer? Right? I mean, don't you want to grow up to be that nails, whether or not you ever get to be an ambassador? But with this signal testimony today, this dramatic appearance today from Ambassador Yovanovitch, I mean, let's just be clear about what's going on here. The impeachment inquiry against President Trump is still as direct and simple as it ever was. The president is being impeached by the House of Representatives because he tried to pull off this scheme in which he tried to get help against the Democrats and against Joe Biden from a foreign country. That is illegal. It is illegal to solicit a thing of value for a U.S. election from a foreign entity. The president has done that. The White House has proven it. The impeachment inquiry is about that. But what Yovanovitch shows us is not just how her story fits into this, but how that violation, both of American law and of the type of behavior that is expected of a president that will result in his impeachment for that behavior, how much that undercuts America's interests writ large, how much it undercuts even specifically what we were trying to do with that one beleaguered country. What Yovanovitch's testimony shows us, what a whole bunch of other State Department people are going to be testifying next week will show us, is this thing that is going to result in all of the evidence coming out, which is that the president couldn't pull this off alone. He did try to implement this through the U.S. government. As such, over and over again, we are seeing this dynamic in which people knew what was going on and people who would not go along with it, people who were in the way, people who saw the illegality of the scheme and either called it that or wouldn't participate in it, those people had to be removed. Those people had to be pushed out. And Marie Yovanovitch, who put on this unbelievably impressive display of integrity today and bravery today in Washington, she is Exhibit A for that. We know more about that today than we knew yesterday. And it turns out that after her, there's a big, long alphabet out there. And the rest of that really came into focus today, too, including a real potential problem for a Trump cabinet secretary who is not the one who just resigned within the last hour. It's a different one. Lots to get to. That's next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.